Hello and welcome to this DC Velocity webcast on closing the performance gap, how to bring every facility up to your top 20%. I'm David Maloney, DC Velocity's Group Editorial Director. Thanks for joining us. Most distribution networks have a handful of high-performing sites, but normally not all of them are top performers. That's because each facility operates with different processes, expectations, and cost structures. So why isn't your entire network able to perform like your top facilities? And more importantly, how do you determine what needs to happen in order to close that performance gap? Today in this webinar, we hope to get some answers for you to those questions. But before we begin our presentation, here are some tips to help you connect and participate in the webcast. Our webcast is designed to be interactive between you and our presenters, so later in the program, we will have a question and answer session to allow you to ask our presenters questions relevant to the topics that we discussed today. Just type your question into the text box on the console, then click the Submit Question button, and you can submit those at any time during the webcast. You don't have to wait to the very end. We'll get to as many of those questions as we can during our presentation. The slides will advance automatically throughout the event. If slides are not advancing, press the F5 key or Control-R on your keyboard, though we do have a limited number of slides today. Mostly it's just going to be a discussion. We also do recommend that you disable your pop-up blockers. And if you're experiencing any technical problems, visit our webcast help guide by clicking on the help link that's below the media player. Now it's my pleasure to introduce today's presenters. Dean Dorcas is the CEO and co-founder of Easy Metrics, and Dwight Klappich is a former vice president and fellow at Gartner. Welcome, gentlemen. It's good to have you with us today.
Excellent. Thank you, Dave. Welcome, Dwight. Welcome, everybody. So, Dwight, let's kick things off today, and let's talk about the core challenge. In your time at Gartner, how prevalent was wide performance variability, and how big of a problem did your clients tell you it was?
Well, this is a vexing challenge that we saw with our clients. I was covering the WMS space. I was in it for over 40 years, and one of the biggest challenges with WMS, and unlike other application areas, if you implemented a financial system, once you put up your general ledger system, was pretty much adopted, across the organization, or even in logistics, a TMS, if you adopted it in North America, it was pretty much adopted across North America, where warehousing, it was adopted pretty much building by building. And so what you ended up with each building had its copy of the WMS. And in many cases, many of our clients, not only was it you had a WMS by building, sometimes you had a different vendor by building. And the processes were different and the people were different. And so you ended up with kind of this vertical view of the world. And as much as companies tried to standardize, they really struggled with that. Now, in some cases, there were pretty big differences between facilities, but in many cases, there didn't need to be as big a differences across facilities. But companies really struggled to standardize across that. And, one of the clients, I had before I left Gartner was a very, very well-known food and beverage company. And they tried for several years to standardize and build a common repository where they could collect data across their SAP sites and their Blue Yonder sites, where they could get a network view across all of their sites. And this is a very sophisticated organization, and they really struggled with that. And then last I heard, they gave up on the project and failed. Just because it was so hard, one, to get the data, standardize it, normalize it, and one, just to figure out how they were going to get that kind of network view. And I think it's just been a very common problem. And then if you can't get the data normalized, then getting the people to actually standardize and get a standardized view across the world becomes very, very difficult to do. And I think very few companies have ever gotten there because of that.
Excellent. So you talk a bit about the challenge of trying to get standardization, give visibility, be able to kind of compare apples to apples. We'll probably go into that a little bit more in our discussion today. But if we look at the main culprits, the root causes of why one site's crushing it, another site might be struggling, what are some of those main culprits that we're going to want to dive into here on trying to get that, the bottom 80% up to that top 20% from a performance standpoint?
Well, I think one of the first thing is when you look at the research, what we find is that in general, 50% of warehouse managers use Excel sitting on top of their WMS, if they have a WMS. And to be frank, most companies, of any size have a WMS. So 50% of warehouse managers use, Excel sitting on top of their WMS to make consequential decisions, which is a pretty sad statement in 2026. And then when you dig into that, you find out that when you survey, 68% of them say that their decision-making process is inefficient because it takes them too much time to collect the data, organize the data to make a decision. So their decisions are very not timely. And then because of that, 40% of them say the decisions that they're making are pretty poor. So what ends up happening is a lot of decisions are being made based on tribal knowledge. So what that means is that a lot of the decisions are left up to how good is the person making this decision, not the systems that we're giving the people to make the decisions because of that. Now, also, when you're depending on Excel, a lot of it depends on how good are the Excel systems that you're using to make those decisions. And we all know, you'd read any research on using Excel to make decisions, there's a lot of bad Excel systems that are built out there. There's lots of logic flaws built into that. So that's one of the problems. And if you look at, the other data, the average age of warehouse manager today is about 47. And then now you're starting to see the age, there's a lot of grain in that. So you'll have that there's a big gap in experience. So you might have one of your warehouse managers that's very experienced, been around for a long time. Maybe it took them 20, 30 years to get to be that warehouse manager. So if he's making or she's making decisions on tribal knowledge, maybe they have a lot of experience and they can be making good decisions, but maybe a younger, less experienced warehouse manager doesn't have that knowledge, but because they don't have tools to make good decisions, they're not able to make that. And so you see this huge disparity in the quality of the decisions they can make because of that. And it's largely because we're not equipping them with the tools that they need and to help them make those kind of decisions. So you see that huge discrepancy. One that, okay, maybe they don't have the best tools. It's like you take a carpenter, you give a really experienced carpenter a handsaw, they can make really good, furniture with that. Yet you might give someone else, power tool, and they can, hopefully not cut their finger off, but still can't do anything with it. And I think it's that same thing that we're seeing in warehouses today, is we're just not equipping them. And then when you see that huge discrepancy, so you have 10 warehouses, one, very experienced person and 9 not very experienced people, and you can see that's one of the big challenges we have today.
Makes sense. When I think through the concept of varying performance across a network, I really like to break it down into 3 areas. The first area is process. That's what you were really hitting on there, as far as the standard operating procedures, the training that people have, inefficient processes, which we'll get into. Maybe I'm traveling too far, I don't have the right level of automation. Things we'll discuss a little further. Then you got performance. Are my teammates performing well, not performing well? That gets into productivity, gets into utilization, et cetera. And then you have, product mix or order profile. So sometimes you might see that one site's underperforming, but it's not really because of a performance issue. It's because they've just got harder freight to deal with or more stringent SLAs, et cetera. So we'll dive into that a little bit more. So from your perspective, what you saw at Gartner, how are companies trying to actually track and benchmark performance across their sites? You mentioned Excel, but give us a little more flavor on what you were experiencing with your clients there.
Well, I mean, the reality is most aren't. That's the reality. Something that we used to look at is, I think, I used to talk a lot about, vertical versus horizontal. So if you look at WMS, as I go back to what I was saying before, is that, we implemented WMSs by site, and, you talk vertically, the decent WMS, a decent commercial WMS system today, it has some form of analytics, and different WMSs would have different depth of analytics around it. So, that would be vertically. So there would be, pretty deep analytics in some of the best WMSs, but, that I could do within a facility. And so, they could, depending on the depth of the analytics that came with the WMS, I could do that within a facility. Now, some are better than others, and some I could do near real time in some WMSs, but I could do that just within my facility. But very few, if any, of the WMSs could do that, what I call horizontally, which would be across the network, where I could start to say, I could provide a single pane of glass to, say the head of North American logistics or warehousing for a company, where they could say, hey, I've got a network of 8 to 10 warehouses where I could do the same thing across my network. Couldn't do that. Most companies would be having to figure out how could I extract that data from those WMSs and put that into something else. So they weren't doing it. At best, they were extracting some of that data, typically ex post facto, on a quarterly basis, maybe monthly basis, very high level performance metrics that they were using just to rate, how well was that warehouse doing, so that, they could say, okay, this warehouse was meeting standards, or this warehouse was not. So they weren't, I would say that it was basically to grade them, not to be able to run the warehouse on a day-to-day basis. So that vertically they could do it, but not horizontally across the network. So
it's an interesting concept I hadn't heard before. What you're saying is basically, if you're looking at it, say quarterly or even monthly, that's more of a grading card to see how somebody's doing, and less about getting that real-time information to try to take action and correct issues.
Well, I mean, they might try to do it to correct action. It's kind of like if I was you think about it, a scorecard's a nice thing to say that, okay, I could look at, how did the game go? I could write an article about it the day after, but it's too late to actually say in the middle of the game, how am I doing? Can't make any corrective action the day after. I say, oh, okay, maybe for the next game, I could make some changes for the next game, but I already lost the game, right? So it's that kind of corrective action. Maybe I can say, well, next month, maybe we'll do something, but it's a little too late to make a change that would affect customer service now. Maybe it'll affect customer service in the future. Where what I want to do is, hey, is there some action I could take right now that could maybe protect me from something that could get me into trouble right now? No, I can't do that typically across the network. I can sometimes do that within a facility. Now, again, some WMSs are better than others at doing that today, but I don't see them being able to do that across the network today in most cases.
That's interesting. So I think about our profit management module, and it's basically a daily P&L with the ability to drill down to customer, process, category, tier, et cetera. And the ability to have it on a daily basis is not just to know which customers are profitable or not. I can probably do that on a monthly basis fine. It's the ability to say, okay, I've got an issue here, being able to drill down in real time to figure out what that root cause is, because it's awfully hard to go back a month later and try to figure out, what was causing a certain low performance KPI, where if I'm getting that much more real time, even, intraday every few minutes, I can quickly identify what the issue is and take action. So we've talked about the variability, it's real and widespread. Let's discuss some of the specific factors that are actually causing that. So when I think about what drives performance across operations and why they vary, it really falls down into 5 areas. The first one's low productivity, obviously. That can vary significantly. There's poor utilization, which really dives into missing time, which is, we'll get into in more detail, but the time where people are paid, but they're not working, they're not in meetings, et cetera, and indirect. Then you drill down from there, you get into excessive overtime, you get into inefficient processes, or if I'm a 3PL, it can tie misaligned pricing. So where I'm pricing based on product mix that they gave me, or maybe they were in before, and then over time that changes, and it's just going to become very difficult to be profitable in those situations. So those are the root cause I see. Dwight, is there any that you've seen in your roles that I might have left off there?
Well, I mean, those are all really important productivity metrics. I think, let's be honest. And the key thing is, since labor represents up to 70% of the cost in the warehouse, I mean, those are by far some of the most important metrics the warehousing and logistics, need to measure. I mean, but however, I would say that there's other metrics that, the warehouse manager is getting a lot of pressure on that don't show up there. I mean, obviously, they're getting, beat up on things like, order cycle times and transportation issues and capacity utilizations that don't necessarily show up there as well. But I mean, I think, they're going to focus on a lot of these issues, because if you can address some of these issues, they will have a big effect on some of those issues. So I think those are absolutely the biggest, things that they're going to focus on from a management standpoint, for sure. So.
I know you worked with a lot of different customers, a lot of different kind of maturity levels in their sophistication there. Can you kind of give us a range of the spectrum from maybe the most basic to maybe some of the cutting edge companies that you saw, and how they really try to manage these issues on performance?
Well, I think the thing that I saw that I think was, we would see that sometimes companies that, we had to protect them from themselves. Sometimes, one of the things I would often, have it sometimes I would say this sounds trite, but this is a perfect example where we'd say this is the perfect place to do a crawl, walk, run, sprint. The thing that would often concern me is if I saw a company that wasn't doing anything here, and they'd bring in either a consultant or an exuberant new industrial engineer, and they saw, oh, hey, we're going to come in here and we're just going to jump to, engineered labor standards, and we're going to just, go and we're going to solve world hunger. I'd often have to counsel them and say, be very, very careful here, because any of these things, it's not, these are not systems that you're going to bring in that the system becomes the job. Some areas, when you buy a system, eventually the system just becomes a job, right? So if you put in a financial system, like an accounting system, at some point in time, your job becomes, putting stuff in the accounts receivable system, and day out, that's your job, right? And there's not a lot, of stuff that you have to encourage people to use it, because that is everything they're going to do that day is that the purchasing system, you're going to use the purchasing system. These type of systems really require a lot to get the people to use the system, to get the benefits out of the system. And if you don't get the organization to really adopt these systems and really buy into what these systems do, I saw more companies, start with the best intentions, end up turning the systems off after a year or two, than the ones that actually, committed to a long term. Because in the end, some of these systems, it's like a marriage. If you're not willing to commit to the long term, they ended up in divorce. So that was the first thing: is start simple. I said, start simple and grow. Do something, get some wins behind you, and then just as you go. And sometimes it's like, well, maybe you don't need to get to world hunger, but you can get a lot of benefit by starting, and maybe you stay simple and that's all you need to do. Others will grow and continue to grow. The other thing is, I often suggested to people, don't overlook education versus training. Other applications, I just need to teach you how to push the buttons. Again, that's not the big issue here, is how I push the buttons. Like on the WMS, I just need to teach the guy in the lift truck, okay, this is how you're going to process an order, pick an order. That's less of an issue here. These are not hard systems to use. It's what I'm doing, why I'm doing it, how I'm doing it. When I get some information out of this system, what am I what's this mean to me and how am I supposed to understand what it's telling me so that I can take action? I mean, again, you're giving warehouse leaders and supervisors information that's going to require them to go take certain actions, and that's more education versus training. So don't overlook that. And I often said it's change management, change management, change management. If you underinvest in some of that, that's where I saw projects fail. Like I said, these are long-term commitments, and that requires like a lot of nurturing, so it's going to be constant, particularly if there's change in management and stuff like that. You bring on new people, so that's what I've seen is like the success of how I've seen these projects roll out. It's not one thing. It's if you get this culture, it's a real culture adoption, and that's what's really going to lead to success long term. On some of it's not any one thing. It's kind of this, getting the buy-in from the organization to kind of commit to something like this.
Your comment reminds me of something one of our customers, TJ McCarthy, said once. He said, "Easy metrics is a great tool, but you still need to swing it." So it kind of sums up some of the things you just talked about. So let's start diving into what we can actually do to start closing this gap. And I think the first place to start is to get to a single metric that you can look at and quickly tell, is the site performing well or are there issues there? And then from there being able to drill down. So getting to that single KPI is a little more challenging sometimes than it might sound. If you're 3PL on a fixed price contract, that might be pretty simple. Are they profitable or not profitable? But if I'm a 3PL on a cost plus, or I'm a wholesaler, retailer, manufacturer, getting to a single metric can be more difficult because you got product mix changes, you got different SLAs, you got a lot of different aspects in there. And I see companies trying to come up with a metric, but if you don't include and take all those things into consideration, it can be pretty misleading or challenging. And I learned that early on with one of our customers. They're a flooring manufacturer. They had 9 sites. They were looking at a cost per unit through the facility. And 8 of those 9 sites all were showing really good improvement. But one of the sites, just their performance appeared to just tank. Their cost per unit just skyrocketed. And it was making that site look very, very poorly run. But as we dove into the details, we found out they had lost their largest customer. They replaced him with a bunch of small customers. They ended up having to do twice the work, travel twice as far to get a unit out the door. So obviously their cost per unit went up. But when you looked at productivity, utilization, all those aspects, they were actually running it very well. And so that experience really led us to develop the concept of targeted cost to serve. So similar to a multi-metric labor standard, with an employee, we don't say, you're at 100 case an hour, Dwight's at 120 case an hour, Dwight's outperforming you. We all know there's a lot of variability, a lot of yeah buts in there. Maybe, that person's traveling to the annex, or that person's doing all the small choppy orders, Dwight's doing Walmart, et cetera. So very similarly, targeted cost to serve just looks at the volume, the product mix, all the requirements in there, and using multi-metrics in a lot of situations, we'll say, okay, here's how much it should cost you to do the work as a facility. And therefore, if I've got the hard customers and Atlanta has the easy customers, it's taking that into consideration. So it gives me that nice, consistent standard that I can compare apples to apples across my sites, or I can also see how a site is improving or not improving over time. So kind of a powerful concept, but that gives us that starting point. So, for the finance leaders that are joining us today, it really gives you a few things. It comes down to 3 things that really drive some value for you. And the first one is really understanding where every labor dollar is being spent within each of the operations. So knowing where the dollars are being spent, broken out by process, category, et cetera. So knowing your cost, but then second, really understanding what the cost to serve is. So it's great that I'm spending $10,000 there, but what's my cost per unit to do that process for that customer, or that process for that vendor, et cetera. So understanding that the cost to serve from an activity-based costing standpoint. And then the third one is being able to understand, okay, well, what was my cost relative to what it should have cost? So that starts opening up where there's opportunities to try to say, okay, we're over here, and it's not just because of tough product mix. There's an issue there. Let's drill down, identify that root cause. So Dwight, throughout your career, I'm sure you saw friction between ops teams and finance teams at a lot of your clients. So how much of that tension you think was actually caused by limited data and visibility rather than the teams themselves? And what did that look like in practice?
Well, yeah, I hate to answer something you're not asking. I'll come back to that in a second, but I think you just said something that if I could just add to that, I think it's really important because I think one of the things that if you look at the research that one of the problems with metrics is that you got to be really careful with metrics because one of the fears is people game the metrics. And there's a lot of research right now that metrics can be very dangerous. And I think what's really important about what you just said, and this is why I wanted to emphasize this, is one of the things that I would say that, I certainly counsel if I was talking to COOs, is you got to be really careful when you start looking at the metrics and standardizing and trying to standardize metrics. Is one of the first things is when you say I've got 10 warehouses, first thing you got to do is how am I calculating those so that I know that I'm consistent in how I calculate those, because I saw some funny instances where, one site was everybody said, wait, so that's not our best site, but their metric always looks good. And you found out it was being calculated wrong. But that's really important, but is also to understand, why we're picking that metric, why it matters, what the impact is, who cares, and all these things that you talked about, but is also to understand some of what you just went through is really important behind the curtain so you're not gaming some of that because, I had one instance where we had a customer where they had a real labor problem. They just couldn't get enough men to work in their warehouse, right? They're in a small community. They just ran out of men. So they're trying to bring in a lot more women into their warehouse. It's a food service warehouse. And so they had some items like these 50-pound bags of dog food and rice, and the men were getting all the heavy items, and a lot of the women they couldn't move some of this stuff. So the men were getting all the heavy stuff, and the women were getting the ramen noodles and stuff. Well, some of their metrics were really off because the women were moving much lighter items. And so all the things you talked about were hidden in the data. So to be able to get down into some of that to see, well, wait a second, you couldn't expect someone to move as many 50-pound bags of rice that you could with, things of ramen noodles, right? So I think that's really important. So I didn't mean to come back to that, but I think that's why that granular information is so important when you start looking under the covers of some of these metrics. But to come back to your question about the ops, I think in finance, this has been a classic, right? And I think the biggest problem between ops and finance is you think they don't like each other. The problem is, and I used to say this jokingly, but there's a little there, is that the problem is that it was like ops was talking English and the finance guys were talking Klingon, right? And the problem was that there's very little finance or money data in WMSs, very little, if any. So the WMS was all kind of operational data, orders and tasks and things like that, but very little of that was monetized. But the finance people wanted stuff about money, things that had money associated with it, right? And so anytime you had to get from the physical world to the monetary world, they had to do that kind of outside the system. And that's where a lot of friction came from. And it was really a data problem, or a lack thereof, really, to be true. And that's where I think a lot of the friction came from. If there was a better way where I could have hit a button and said, well, let me make it easier for me to monetize some of that data that sat in because the WMS it was not for lack of data. It just wasn't easy for me to convert that or monetize that information in a way first that was realistic. And so that was where the friction came from. It was just they wanted the same thing, just one wanted in English and the other wanted in Klingon. One wanted in physical data and the other one wanted in monetary. And so that's where the friction really came from. And that was because just most WMSs didn't make that easy.
That makes sense. So it's interesting. You brought up the whole importance of getting the KPIs really dialed in so they're telling you the accurate information. The first 10 years of our company, we really tended to focus on site by site. We'd roll out labor management in a site, then the next 2 sites for a company, but it was really a site level solution. I'd say for the last 7 years, we really changed, and now we really focus on the network level, the value there. And obviously we drill down to the site level and supervisor, employee, everything. But we see a lot of strategic value from getting that benchmarking across the network. And to do that, you really need to make sure that you have that consistent hierarchy, structure, definitions in place across the network, so you're comparing apples to apples. And one thing that we've really stressed is when we go into these, getting a network view to begin with. How are we going to structure departments? How are we going to structure processes? What are we using for categories and tiers? So it's apples to apples, because if not, you can't do any sort of benchmarking. So that's the first area that was critical. And the second area is looking at the labor standards and trying to normalize those as much as possible. If I just said this site I'm holding to 100 cases an hour and that site I'm holding to 150 cases an hour because they have bigger customers, it's really hard to try to really benchmark and identify what the issues are. But if you're basing your labor standards on multi-metrics that take that order profile, that product mix into consideration, giving them labor standard based on orders, lines, cases, feet traveled, et cetera, then I can have different order profiles, product mix coming in, and I still have that nice apples to apples comparison. So really thinking through it at a network level and not just letting each site design it however they want to design it, because then you lose that benchmarking capability. All right, so we're tracking well on time here. Let's start diving into a little more of the detail on what those specific things are in there. So we've talked about kind of a single metric. Let's dive down into what data is needed in order to really pull this level of insight together. So you have any feedback on that?
Well, I mean, the key, I think, is the challenge comes down to, first off, I think one of the biggest challenge that we saw is that as we started off, kind of going back to when we first started, is that, when you look at, you talk to a lot of companies, they, have multiple systems that the data sits inside. Now, if I go into a single facility, not all my information sits inside just the WMS. I might have a WMS, I might have a time and attendance system, I might have a fleet manager, sitting on my lift truck. So the first problem I have is that, someone logs on to the time, well, they first come in and they clock into the time and attendance system, and then they'll go and log on to the WMS, and, they might log on to the lift truck, and, their information for me to figure out what's going on. Well, they clocked in at 7 o'clock in the morning onto the time and attendance system. Well, 15 minutes later, they log on to the lift truck, and then they log on to the WMS, and, well, how do I get a true picture? So that's one of the first problems, is the information sits in multiple systems. And one of the problems we see is, these are humans. They might log into one system and log out. And then there's other problems, is that, I'm trying to pull data out, for what they're doing, and there's, they're logged into one process. And so that is one of the challenges of getting a real view of what's going on, is that, it's just to see what's going on. Oh, I'm logged on because I'm supposed to be picking, but I'm actually not doing that right now. I was supposed to have logged out of one system. So I think that is part of the challenge that we see in these systems. And then you compound that by the fact that if I'm trying to do this across the network, there could be multiple different WMSs, multiple different time and attendances, and on and on and on. So I think that's one of the first problems that we've seen. And you and I've talked about this going back many years, that was one of the first problems that Easy Metrics had to figure out how to solve, is to get a total picture of an 8-hour day. How do we get that data from those systems and get a total picture of what's Dwight's day look like? Well, I got to pull those, that time and attendance data, combine it with a WMS, combine it with the fleet manager to say, okay, well, Dwight logged on at this time, and then you did this and this and this. So I think that's one of the first, challenges we saw right there.
Yeah,
But then
Dwight,
I think, go ahead.
it's fascinating that when we work with, because we combine data sources together and we look at the telematics on the forklifts, and that's probably about as good as you're going to get because the employee's right there on the forklift, they've got the telematics on the forklift. But what we found is about 33% of the time, the employee's actually logged into the wrong job code on the telematics. You know, they're logged into picking, and all of a sudden we see in the WMS put away scans coming in, or vice versa. And so what we've found is the key, and this is really the heart of trying to get to all this, is you can't just look at the data sources, you know, stick AI at it and say, go tell me what's going on in my warehouse. You got to take those different data sources, you got to normalize it so that they can play together. You got to merge it together, and then you got to write some very complex business logic to make sense of all that, to really identify what's going on, even though the employees might be logged into the wrong job code, et cetera. And once you do that, then you get this transformed data that now I can plug AI into, which I think if we have time, we'll do a little more deep dive into. But now I can really start identifying what's going on. But if I just tried to look at each individual data source in a silo, it's just going to give me misleading information. So let's keep moving on here. So we've kind of talked high level. Let's drill down into kind of the root cause issues of what's keeping some of those sites underperforming that top 20%. So obviously employee productivity is probably the biggest one that I've seen out there anyway. What's your experience when you're at Gartner? Did that come up a lot, and what were companies kind of trying to do to get a handle on productivity?
What do you mean by that? I'm sorry, before I answer the wrong question. So
I'd say, you know, what were the biggest challenges you saw? What did best in class look like when it came to really managing productivity at some of your more sophisticated customers?
Well, I think the challenge that we saw, I mean, the first thing is like I said before, you know, if I went out and I got an industrial engineer that, you know, went to Georgia Tech and got their degree, of course, they're going to come in, and this is the classic can't see the forest through the trees kind of thing. They're going to say it has to be deep engineered, you know, standards. And I'll never forget, I was talking to a client one time, and I told this story that they're doing a warehouse tour. And they're walking through the warehouse, and it was 7 o'clock in the morning, and you know they're walking along with the warehouse manager, and they saw this whole group of people walking across the warehouse. And guy asked the warehouse manager, "What's with this parade of people walking across the warehouse?" They said, "Well, they just clocked in." And he goes, "Okay, where are they going?" And they said, "Well, they're going to the lift trucks." And he goes, "Okay, well, where are the lift trucks?" And the lift trucks are on the other side of the warehouse. And so later on, they were going, "Well, how long does it take them?" It was like about 15 minutes from the time they clocked in to the time they got in the lift trucks. And so later in the day, they're going through this, and they realized that, you know, they were down and they're really focused in on, you know, doing the deep edge, you know, the gold zone and below the knees and above the shoulders, and getting real granular. And they realized when they looked at it that from the time they clocked into the you know, the time in attendance, the time they clocked onto the lift trucks, that was 15 minutes, 4 times a day. They clock in the morning, clock in the lift trucks, clock out at lunch, clock back in, clock out at the end of the day. You know, that was 1 hour a day, 5 hours a week, 250 hours a year. And they were down to worrying about a minute here, a minute there. So they were really focused on the wrong problem. You know, maybe once they got, that was back to my crawl, walk, run. So they were so myopically focused on the wrong problem. And I think this is one of the problems, is that the industrial engineers, that's what they're trained at. Nothing wrong, don't please, if there are any industrial engineers on here, I'm not faulting your career path. It's just sometimes it's they're focused in the wrong area. It's that wasted time. It's the, you know, really focus on the low hanging fruit. And to some people, maybe that's all they need to focus on. There's plenty of opportunities to really, you know, drive value, short-term value. And because, you know, in the past, you know, that's where I saw people run into problems to get to the real deep, you know, engineered standards and some of that. That's where it was a long-term commitment. And it took a lot. Now technology is helping us in some of those areas. So I think we'll talk about that a little later, you know, that now technology can do some of the things that made it much more difficult in the past. But in some of those productivity gains that's where we can really get some big short-term hits, focusing on the big issues, where that's where I think some companies have gotten themselves in trouble of focusing in the wrong areas. We're not really looking for it, also sometimes is I think using the system, you've made some observations here today, is focusing on the minutia and not the information that the system could be giving me that might indicate doing something else that would have a bigger impact. So using the system to say, look, I've got an excess amount of travel time here, that maybe that would tell me that the more important thing for me to do might be to reslot my warehouse to move goods, would have a bigger impact than worrying about how long it takes me actually pick an individual case. Because, hey, wait a second, I've got an awful amount of, travel time here that might suggest I've got my items in the wrong place that says, maybe I should move those to the front of my warehouse. But it's that's why I say it's learning from what the system's going to tell me that might have bigger impacts. And I think that could have a bigger impact on productivity than some of the other things. So I think that's some of the key things that I think some people are starting to learn from this.
Yeah, so Dwight, I'd sum up some of the things you just said there. So you mentioned crawl, walk, run. One thing we work with our customers on is to map out a maturity curve that takes all this different functionality. It might be a 2 or 3 or 4 year path to get fully deployed to what they want to do. But on day one, some of the first things you focus on is that missing time. And there's usually about an hour per day per employee of missing time that they're just, they're not working, they're talking to their buddy, they're leaving for break early, whatever it is. But that's the lowest hanging fruit. Focus on that initially, get people to at least work full time. Then the walk side of it starts getting into, okay, now that they're working full time, let's get them working on productive, value added tasks as much as possible. So let's drive that indirect down. And oftentimes there's 3 to 10% labor cost savings just by really aggressively looking at that. And that's where benchmarking really comes into play. Then from there, you move into productivity. With productivity, you have to have multi-metric labor standards. The number one reason labor management fails and the number one reason pay for performance fails is the labor standards aren't fair or they become obsolete. So, being able to get those up and running, but doing it in a way that isn't, $100,000 per site, that's where the data-driven models are so effective. They get you your multi-metric labor standards and you can keep them updated across a global network in real time. That's absolutely critical. And then from there, you can start getting into the more advanced stuff, like you hit on the process optimization, identifying where my processes are inefficient, using the cost to serve data, using the metric ratios to really identify that. And then finally, the last one is tying in that profit management, getting to that daily visibility of what's working, what's not working, and being able to drill down from there. So it is definitely a path over time to get there. If you throw too much, it's just overwhelming. But you just start focusing on that, the first two, you're going to get about 50% of your savings just by getting your missing time and utilization optimized. And so we often say, especially working with our network clients, go wide before you go deep. Let's get the visibility across your network ASAP. Let's get that benchmarking. Let's identify that waste. Let's drive that out. From a change management, it's very low lift. Get that in place, capture those savings, get a good cadence going, and then we can start focusing on productivity, and working with employees and teammates to try to drive that higher. There's still another 50% of the savings there, but it is harder to achieve from a change management standpoint, as you talked about there.
No, and absolutely, and I think one thing we haven't talked about here, and I think this is something that I think there's been a change in paradigm in what these systems are used for as well. That's a little hidden here. Is 10 years ago, I think there was a punitive mindset on how these systems were used, is that I was buying these systems to basically use it to identify my lowest performers and to get rid of them. And that was my main goal. Now there's still probably some people looking there, and yeah, we all have low performers who are probably going to do that. But a lot of companies realize, hey, I can't run my business that way anymore, because if I get rid of my bottom 10% of my performance, I might not be able to find 10% people to replace them. But I think more companies now are looking at, how could I use this to run my operations better? So they'll use these as coaching mechanisms. They'll learn as, how can I learn from this so I can run my operations better? And it's a very different mindset. And so I think some companies might not get to run, or if they're getting to run, they're doing that in a way to say, how can I run my operations? What can I learn from this so that I can figure out, okay, here's how I can use this information. Like I said, they might use this information. When should I start to reslot my warehouse? Oh, I've learned that, hey, I'm seeing travel time go up. Hey, that's a good indicator. Maybe I need to reslot. Okay, it's telling me something that is going to let me learn something that tells me go do something else. So it's a different paradigm for how I use these systems than, oh, just give me every once a month, a stack ranking of my employees so I get rid of the bottom 10% of my employees. That's not the way I see people using this anymore.
So Dwight, I want to do a quick pivot here. So when you were at Gartner, I think you really focused on 3 areas: the WMS, labor management, and robotics. And towards the end, it seemed like robotics became your primary focus there. So in the context of what we're talking about today, getting all sites up to that 20% level, how does automation actually fit into that?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is I just did my 4th annual robotics study with an organization. And I kind of forced my way in to do this robotics study. And the number one challenge that organizations identified in pursuing robotics was their ability to build a realistic business case. And one of the things that I used to ask companies, if they were telling, they'd come to me and say, hey, we're thinking about doing robotics. And if one of the things I'd say are you using a labor management system or something equivalent? And if they weren't, I would say, it's something I would seriously consider doing. And the reason is that one of the problems that we saw were never-ending proof of concepts, where people would, they'd talk to a robotics company, and let's be honest, and every robotics company come in and say, oh yeah, we're going to solve world hunger, come to us. And they would all have their model, and nothing wrong with them. I mean, I wouldn't say that they were lying, but let's be honest, their proof of concept models and their, ROI models were a little biased, as they should be. They're vendors, they're trying to sell something. But we would see companies, they would go spend 6 months, a year doing a proof of concept, and we would see a lot of those proof of concepts fail because they were pursuing the technology without really understanding, is this the right place for us to be looking? And what we said, if they were using a labor management system or something equivalent, they had more information about, hey, where are the places where we really have some opportunities to exploit, automation? And they'd have much better data if they were to go say, hey, here's what it's costing me to, do my picking operation. Say I'm a e-commerce, fulfillment operation. Here's how many, order lines a day I'm doing, and here's what my labor cost is per line item or whatever. The information you could do through your cost to serve would be hugely valuable information for me to have if I started to go, hey, I'm going to bring in Geek Plus or Locus, to have that information, for me to really start to try to build a business case. So I think it's really critical information, gives me much better information. Yeah, my WMS could tell me how many, order lines per day am I doing, but it didn't really give me a lot of good information that I could then use to try to say, hey, if I were to go from a purely labor-based, kind of environment to maybe a collaborative robot and, kind of model to a purely automated model, what would be that? And then what's the cost of that? So I think that's was certainly something that the companies that did have a labor management system were in a much better place for trying to do that kind of ROI calculation. So that's what I saw.
2 things from you there. One, I've heard Raymond, the forklift company, talk about this several times, but they often say, optimize before you automate, which is kind of what you're saying there. Get your processes efficient before you just throw investment at it, because that might solve the problem or it might not solve the problem. And then 2, once it's optimized, really understanding your cost to serve. What's my cost when it's purely manual? but what's my cost when it's a hybrid model, and what's my cost when it's a fully automated model? And then you can really tell, is it making sense or not making sense? And one thing we hear from our clients a lot, going back to your example with the vendors, is they're given an ROI projection that sounds great, but they don't actually hit it. And it's not necessarily because the robots aren't working right, it's because the robots aren't being utilized to the full extent. So being able to really get that visibility and have those measuring systems in place make a lot of sense. So we often say, if you're going to prioritize putting a system in place that's, one, going to optimize, but two, is going to give you that measuring stick so I can see what's actually working, what's not working, and then that helps with all of your other initiatives. So
yeah, you're absolutely right. So oftentimes we'd see someone build a business case, worst case, best case, and you go, well, what if I went from worst case to okay case to best case? You go, wait a second, the cost differential from okay to best is significant. Well, I'll just, okay would be good enough, right? I couldn't see the justifications. You're absolutely right. If I could optimize for okay, just say, look, if I could get my productivity and my labor up to a certain point, that's good enough. Well, then it didn't make sense to automate. And but they didn't do that. They're always taking worst case to absolute best case. And then we all know, even at best case, there's a lot of variability built into that as well, and so absolutely. And that's why I was always saying, it's much cheaper to put a system in, get it, maximized or optimized, as you said, your labor as it is now, and then see where you go from there, than to say, I'm going to jump right into automation. I mean, some of the robot systems, like Locus, okay, well, if you fail, you send them back, but other types of automation, you kind of made the investment, you're stuck with it.
So let's finish up with the role of AI within distribution. So, warehouse operations are really sitting on a gold mine of data. When you get that transformed data, there's so much valuable information buried in there. And we really see agentic AI as what enables the customers to have the agentic AI do all the mining, and then they just have to harvest that. So, great value and potential there, but there's also real risk. And I think the temptation is trying to just plug a LLM into your data and expecting accurate and actionable answers. That's not how it works. We've all seen lots of examples of hallucinations and bad data and everything else. So, the way we think about Easy Metrics is LLMs are very powerful for surfacing insights and communication, but we don't allow them to do the math. That's where the problems come in. So, making sure there's no LLM math, making sure there's a verified audit trail, making sure the math and logic's transparent, so everything's defensible, everything's locked down. Once you do that, then LLMs are great to summarize that, to stack rank it, whatever. But you just got to be very careful on how you're using AI so that you're getting the value without throwing a lot of errors in there, as I think we've all run into. So, Dwight, I know you've been doing a fair amount of research lately into that. I'd love to hear your final thoughts kind of on AI within the distribution environment and what companies should be thinking about.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, it's Gartner, used to do hype cycles, and there's a reason for that. Is I think there's a lot of hype around AI, and certainly agentic AI. I think there's a couple of issues that people should be very cognizant with AI. One is be very cautious of the cost differential. I was looking at something. I was just speaking at a conference a few weeks ago, and I was getting prepared. I was doing some research, and I said, well, if I could solve something with RPA and I could also solve it with agentic AI, I said, what was the compute differential between those? And it came back, it was 25x differential between RPA and agentic AI. And I was like, well, you're paying for that. So you have to be very careful. As like you said, if it's something that I could solve with an algorithm versus agentic AI, and is 25x compute time, why would I do it with agentic AI, right? So that's one of the first things, is pick the right tool. This is one of the first things I tell clients is, I said, you got to look at anything as it relates to AI as a toolbox. What's the right tool to solve the problem? So I think, I use the example hey, if you're going to hang a picture, and you say, I'm just going to go put a hook in the wall to hang a picture. Well, you could take a screwdriver and use the back end of a screwdriver and pound it into the wall. Okay, you could. You're liable to hurt yourself, and it's going to take a lot longer. The better tool is probably a hammer, right? It's going to be easier. You could probably pound it in with 2 or 3 hits and not hurt yourself. Vice versa, if you're going to screw something in, you got a screw. Probably you could hammer it in with a hammer, but probably better use a screwdriver. And then the next question is, well, is it a flathead or a Phillips head? Well, if it's a Phillips head, you might be able to get it in with a flathead screwdriver, but you're not going to be able to put a Phillips head in with a flathead in with a Phillips head screwdriver. So you pick the right tool. So the first thing is, if it's algorithmic, then pick the right algorithm. So if it's a machine learning problem, then use a machine learning algorithm. If it's something that fits a large language model, then use a large language model. So I think that's the right thing. But you're absolutely right. The other thing that I think is that we're seeing from managers, people, users don't like black boxes in general. And this is not new. We saw this in production scheduling systems 25 years ago when we were doing genetic algorithms. What I think users are going to want is human in the loop. Let the large language model give options to users, say, hey, this is what we think, but let the user make the decision. Maybe at some point in time. So a lot of this autonomous decision making, I think maybe for some simple decisions, but I think we're going to want to see more human in the loop kind of stuff. The way I've seen that is, in an autopilot, as I'm flying and the plane's making minor adjustments, what I don't want is the autopilot to say I'm supposed to land in Mexico City and divert me to Rio de Janeiro. I want the human to be in the loop on stuff like that. So I think those are kind of things, that we see in this. But I think you're absolutely right. I mean, agentic AI definitely has a place, but what we're seeing is that kind of human kind of interaction. And I think there's certain places, that it's absolutely going to have, some impact, but I don't think we're going to see this as fully autonomous decision making. And if it's an algorithm, and I think an algorithm solves the problem better, then it should be an algorithm. If for no other reason, cost basis. If I can solve this with pure math, then do it pure math. And we've seen some smarter vendors figure this out on their own. That saw one WMS vendor said, wait a second, if it's a classic travel path optimization, we've got algorithms that can solve that better, faster, quicker, cheaper than trying to do that, in agentic AI. And I could build that actually into agentic AI where it actually fires off, to do it with an algorithm. So I think we just have to get past the hype. I mean, I think some vendors they're just using it. Oh, look how cool my thing is. It's agentic AI. Well, okay, are you really solving a problem, or is it pure marketing? I prefer real solutions versus hype solutions. So.
Excellent. Well, Dwight, we're coming up on the top of the hour. Let me just kind of wrap things up, and then we'll turn it back to Dave. Dave, I apologize. I think I took up your Q&A time. But just kind of wrapping up what we covered today. So the performance gap between your top 20% and the rest of your network is real, significant, and closable, but closing it requires a systematic approach, not a one-time initiative. Underperformance across all sites traces back to 5 root causes, as we discussed: productivity, utilization, overtime, process efficiency, and misaligned pricing. Standardization is the foundation. Set your department process hierarchy at the network level, so you're comparing the same work across sites. Use multi-metric labor standards to allocate the time earned for each factor, so your targets are consistent and fair regardless of those order profiles. The targeted cost to serve that we talked about, it's really the bridge between operational execution and financial outcomes. It really gives you that ability to drill down and see your costs on activity-based basis, at process, category, tier, customer level, et cetera. And then being able to drill down to determine that root cause issue. We talked about going wide before you go deep. Capture the low-hanging fruit, the utilization, the missing time. Those are your easiest savings. And then finally, data alone. We didn't really get into this. We ran out of time, but the execution, the executive oversight is really critical in there, and making sure that you got that executive oversight really driving things. So I will wrap it up with that and turn it back over to you, Dave.
Thank you, Dean and Dwight. Good discussion. And as we mentioned, we won't have time for the Q&A session, but go ahead and submit those questions anyway, and we can have someone follow up with you directly. We also encourage you to go to easymetrics.com for more information on what you discussed today, and also check out our resources box in the console. We've got an interesting report there that you can download. Again, that's found in the resources box. Shortly after this live event, you'll receive an email reminder to access the presentation on demand. You can view it one more time, or you could also share it with a colleague. Again, our thanks to Dean and Dwight for a great discussion today. Very informative. Thank you, gentlemen. And we'd also like to thank our viewers for being with us. We know that your time is valuable, and we appreciate that you chose to spend part of your day watching this webinar. From all of us at DC Velocity, I'm Dave Maloney. Have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.